All right, it's 3:02 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, the 2nd of October. My name is Tricia Yeo, the CEO of IDEAS, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. And I'd like to warmly welcome all of you to our webinar, which is the norm these days. And the title of today's webinar is The Future of Malaysia's Energy Mix. A little bit of background about IDEAS for those who don't know about us. We are an independent, not-for-profit policy think tank that works on providing policy solutions to the country's major public policy challenges. And our vision is to uphold a country that's based on the principles of liberty and justice. And our mission would be to work towards a competitive economy, upholding the institutions, restoring trust in institutions, and of course, looking towards inclusive growth and inclusive development. So with that background, I'd also like to talk a little bit about the work that we have been doing over energy. So on that, I suppose it would be a good time to introduce to you Dr. Renato Lima de Oliveira, who you would probably see on your screen. Dr. Renato is a PhD graduate from MIT. He did his PhD on energy, specifically on oil and gas in Malaysia, and I suppose that's how he ended up in this country. He can tell you more about why he chose Malaysia. He is currently full-time with the Asia School of Business, which is based in Kuala Lumpur. And Dr. Renato has authored 2 papers on energy on behalf of IDEAS, where he's also a senior fellow. And the paper that we are discussing and officially launching today is a paper that is jointly written by Dr. Renato, as well as Matthias Warming, who is also here on the screen. And the paper is available already on our website. It was published yesterday. It's our Policy Ideas number 64, published in October. And it talks about the future of Malaysia's energy mix. And I won't take too much time, but essentially the backdrop to this is that we know that while Malaysia is planning its next phase of its energy policy, it will need to increase the share of sustainable energy, or rather those are the questions that we like to address. But we also understand that the Malaysian government is also placed in a peculiar challenge where it needs to balance other demands of access, affordability, as well as job creation. Malaysia has done uniquely well in having and developing a diversified energy mix, which includes substantial growth in various sectors. And it has also driven, our growth and development story quite significantly. But today, I think we will have a very interesting discussion because I'd like to welcome our esteemed speakers and panelists. So perhaps I can already introduce them with the background so that when we start the discussion, we can go and we can launch straight into the contents without taking too much time on the honorifics. So as I mentioned earlier, Professor Renato is an assistant professor of business and society at the Asia School of Business and a senior fellow at IDEAS. Matthias Warming is a climate change mitigation and corporate sustainability professional with 6 years advisory experience, and he has an MBA and a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental and Social Economic Planning. We also have with us, and thank you so much for agreeing to join us as discussing today, we have Datuk Fazlur Rahman bin Zainuddin, who is the former CFO of Tenaga Nasional for 6 years, and he's currently the Chief Strategy and Regulatory Officer effective from 1st August 2018. He has served in many other companies prior to joining TNB at NASA Group, PwC, Shell Malaysia, Telecom Malaysia in various financial management roles. And last but not least, we have Dr. Sanjayan Vilautam. Dr. Sanjayan also started his career at TNB, so there's a common thing there, but currently he is the CEO of SEDA, and he has more than 30 years of experience in the industry. He has a doctoral degree in engineering and a senior member of the Institution of Engineers Malaysia, and they both have very very illustrious careers behind them. So I'm sure that we'll have a very substantial discussion today. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to pass the time now to our two authors of the paper, Dr. Renato and to Matthias. So Dr. Renato, you can take it away, and I understand that you'll be sharing some slides with us. You're on mute currently, Renato, so we can't hear you. Okay, apologies for the technical difficulty. Renato, you can hear me? You need to unmute yourself. No, we can't hear you. Okay, apologies to the guests and thank you for waiting.
Sorry about that. Zoom is playing a trick with me because I'm using a double monitor here to better do the presentation, but it did disappear.
Okay.
With
all good now. Over to you.
Okay, but can you do you see the slides?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. Sorry for that. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity for Matthias and I to speak today about this extremely timely issue of the future of Malaysia's energy mix. And we have such a privilege of speaking with Datu Fazlur and Dr. Sanjayan, and also moderated by my dear colleague Trisha Yo, which we believe that this is one key aspect of policy that is not related to energy consumption, but also things broader than that, but job generation, preparing the country for post-oil era, and so on. So it is indeed a great pleasure to be speaking to you all and this audience about this. So to start, let me provide a quick introduction of the challenge of energy policymaker. People like our esteemed guests, Datu Fazlur and Dr. Sanjayan, it has traditionally been a challenge in this sector to consider the ability for create incentives to increase the supply of energy, make sure that the country would have enough energy to sustain its economic growth, that you wouldn't face a blackout, but do so in a way that it's affordable. That has been one traditional challenge. More recently, we have added, society added the environmental concern, the issue of environmental sustainability. So then you end up with not only the challenge of making sure that you increase the supply of energy source, then you do that in an affordable way. The third thing is to do that in a way that reduces your carbon emissions per unit of energy generated. And let me also add that you do all of these three things together without creating a political backlash. That you're also able to combine these things, this hard to achieve balance, while not hampering all of the livelihoods of people who work in industries that are today based on carbon fossil fuel emissions, or they are on the extractive sector. So these are big challenges. We provide some humble answers to some of these challenges, or at least indications of where do we think that the priorities should lean in the case of Malaysia. In this just recently launched paper. So here we have a timeline of the development of Malaysia's energy policy. And let me highlight the 74. It has been a major milestone in Malaysia, because that was the creation of Petronas and the Petroleum Development Act. And through that, the country was able not only to increase its extraction of oil and gas, of important resource, but also to develop oil and gas supply chain. And Tricia mentioned that I came first studying the oil and gas industry of Malaysia. I did my PhD. It also involved Malaysia, Brazil, and Mexico. So I came to Malaysia to understand how it did industrial policy related to the energy sector. But I stayed for the beef rendang and the nasi lemak. In all the fantastic Malaysian people and the fantastic project that we have in our school, Asian School of Business. But it has been a milestone, the creation of Petronas. And here we had the growth of natural gas and oil, a lot of ability to grow based on that source. In the paper, we also talk about the consolidation that led to the creation of Tenaga, and the integration of the grid and so on. But more recently, in the 2000s, we have seen a push towards diversification of energy sources. We have the National Biofuel Policy, the Industry Act, and another major milestone, we could put it that way, was the Renewable Energy Act and establishment of SEDA, that we have Dr. Sanjayan here as a representative. So that has been the development of Malaysia's energy policy. You can see that it has followed more or less a trajectory of it nationalized its oil and gas resource at the time that was critical in '74, that just followed the first OPEC oil shock. It provided more strength and tried to create more of a biofuels and renewable energy in the 2000s and so on. But despite that, and these are all very important milestones, despite that, when we actually look at the data, Malaysia has made a strong bet on coal use in recent years. It has grown 70-fold from 1998 to 2016. So if you look at the generation or the data from the Energy Commission, and you look at, okay, where does the electricity of Malaysia is coming from? Which source? 46% in 2016 came from coal and coal alone. 46%, that's almost half. So, for example, when we talk about the growth of electrical vehicles as one potential more environmentally friendly turn, if you do have a grid that is run on coal, that won't do you any good. So then we start to think about, okay, so if you have so much coal, at the same time that it's famous to be an oil and gas producer, what's going on? Going deeper into that issue, one of the things that Matthias and we did was to analyze the position of Malaysia in terms of energy markets. So here I present you some data on the trade on energy. And here we have Malaysia, which is in a very odd position in comparison to most countries in the world. Most countries in the world, when they are rich in gas, they tend to use gas for their own industrialization, their own resource, and then they export the surplus. So here, all these positive numbers is because they are gas exporters. Coal, you might be, if you're rich in coal and you have Indonesia, for example, that has both gas and coal. So Indonesia exports both gas and coal. Same for Russia, and to some extent now to Australia. Australia has developed a lot of recent gas. So it used to have these negative numbers in trade for gas, but now it has going to be positive. And here is all equalized. So what we did here was to consider all of them in terms of terawatt hour. So that allows this comparison. So Malaysia in this position of exporting gas, but importing coal. And that takes us to an environmental issue that also might conflict with some of the environmental pledges. And I will invite my colleague Matthias Varney to talk more about this part.
Yeah, thank you, Renato. So we dove into the latest publicly available data from the Malaysian government, which comes from the third national communications from MESTEC, as it was at the time, to the United Nations Framework Convention Secretariat on climate change. And so these are some of the top line numbers. So essentially, Malaysia has quite a gap between the current state and the pledge to reduce the carbon intensity of the Malaysian economy by 45% relative to GDP by 2030. So just to introduce the naming convention from that report. So you have the business as usual case that basically assumes nothing changes from 2010, I think. Then you have the plan scenario, which is the most recent, or it includes the policies that were in place at the time of writing. So this is from December of 2018. And then you have the ambitious scenario, which includes a number of other possible policy initiatives that could bring the emissions of Malaysia's economy lower. So on the right here, we have some of the initiatives that were suggested in that report by MESTEC to bring down the emissions from the Malaysian energy sector, which is where the bulk of the savings come from. I believe it's around 80% of the difference between the plan scenario and the ambitious scenario come from the energy sector. So as we can see here on the right, it looks broadly at different approaches. So it's both additional renewable energy, it's increased thermal efficiency, it's energy efficiency, all at the same time. So next slide, Renato. So we also looked at what has been done so far to introduce a broader, or to introduce renewable energy into the grid in Malaysia. So it started with the feed-in tariff in 2012, was really where renewables really started moving into the Malaysian energy system. So that achieved around 600 megawatts of installed capacity. There are, because the report we're working off of is from 2018, so not many installations from the LSS have been there, but a few hundred megawatts have been introduced through that scheme in recent years as well. So there really have been quite a bit of effort on behalf of the Malaysian government to introduce renewables in order to meet this carbon intensity reduction pledge. So next slide, please, Renato. So, but the situation we're in now is that renewables by their nature are quite difficult to integrate into the grid system, because a lot of the bulk of the renewables we see integrated into the grid in Malaysia is solar PV, which comes with some inherent challenges. Specifically, it's variable in output. So obviously it only produces when the sun is out, and thus it's not dispatchable. So you can't switch it on when it needs to come on. And so until a time comes where we have storage solutions, either through batteries or through an intermediate medium like hydrogen, or there's many burgeoning technologies out there to solve this problem, most of which are, at least in the near term, very costly. So we need something for this transition period. So it's also important to note that while the current timeline for Malaysia's greenhouse gas pledges internationally go to 2030, that's just the beginning. Like we should, as a global society, be on a path that leads us more or less to a 100% renewable future. Yeah, that's the the joint agreement under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But in the interim, we need to be able to switch on the light when we flick on the switch. And so what we looked at here is how do we try to achieve both of those goals. So prepare Malaysia for a green energy future, while still in the next decade or two, until we can get to a very high percentage of renewables, still make sure we can switch on the lights, we can run our businesses and so on. So that's the challenge. Next slide, Renato. Of course, nothing is complete in 2020 without looking a little bit about what impacts we should expect from COVID-19. So we are, it's always difficult to see what will be the impact of a financial crisis like the one we're in as a result of the global pandemic. But we tried to look a bit at the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9 to get some clues as to what we can expect. Essentially, what we found is that a number of countries had an immediate reduction in emissions due to reduced economic output, but essentially it bounced back to more or less the same trajectory as they were on, both in terms of emissions and in terms of economic growth. So since we're looking at in Malaysia an intensity target, so we still think it's reasonable to look at the trajectory Malaysia was on with regards to both emissions and economics, and more or less use that as a guide. Of course, also, as I said, 2030 is not the end game. That's an intermediary target. So just to highlight this as a path we're going on. So I'll throw back to Renato for the policy implications of this.
Thank you so much, Matthias. So I think that lays out the context, the trade-offs that we face as a nation. In the energy industry, policy means a lot. Policy determines a lot of the incentives and investments. In fact, the International Energy Agency has a study that of the $1.8 trillion that is invested every year in the energy industry, about 2/3 of it is either determined directly by policy incentives or done through what in Malaysia is called government-linked companies. So these are companies that have the majority of ownership of government. So policy is critical. So one of the policies that we suggest is really to take a look into what we call the low-hanging fruit. It's the replacing of coal for natural gas. Why? Because natural gas has about half of the carbon content per emission of coal, and also natural gas in Malaysia can be domestically sourced. One of the reasons why coal had increased over the years was that Malaysia had a crisis over natural gas in Peninsular Malaysia that led to issues in its supply. But in a more globally integrated market, you can compensate these issues. There are other also advantages of natural gas over coal, but to be clear, this comparison, this table here, you could look at it as a beauty contest in reverse. So if you really want to decarbonize the world, you would say that you don't want to go to any one of them, neither coal nor natural gas. But if you still have to face the issue of intermittency of most of the modern renewables, mainly solar PV for Malaysia, you will need a conventional source of energy that is able to be dispatchable. And then natural gas has some advantage over coal. And in the case of Malaysia, you also face less of political backlash. For example, in Australia had a political backlash because then they have big coal mining activity and jobs associated with that and so on. In the case of Malaysia, the coal is essentially imported. And so you do not get the same revenues that you have if you incentivize more of the natural gas exploration to try to bring back more to Malaysia and so on. But that is the low-hanging fruit. I think thinking about energy policy goes way beyond thinking just about the mix itself that you are going to see in the electricity markets, but also how can you think about the changes, the challenges that are coming through this energy transition and create some opportunities. I think one of the key issues that we have seen throughout different countries is that you need to promote adaptation. In that case, considering the diversified supply chain, the oil and gas supply chain in Malaysia, one of the suggestions here is to support the upgrading of capabilities of that oil and gas supply chain to be able to unlock new resource, and that includes gas fields in Malaysia with high CO2 content, but also to promote international expansion, to be able to tap into other resources and be less dependent of just the market in Malaysia. Another industry support thing that we highlight is to diversify renewables by promoting diversify companies to renewables by promoting what are transferable skills, what kind of skills that the current oil and gas players that they have that can be also used for renewables. So in that sense, you promote a smooth transition. You create opportunities for them to not be just a loser in this energy transition. From the point of view of governments, it's also extremely important to be mindful to reduce the fiscal dependence, reduce the amount of revenues that goes straight to the public budget every year. One of the characteristics of oil and gas production, at least the price, is that it fluctuates a lot, and this year has shown it more than ever, up to the point that the price of crude oil went to negative price in the US for one particular contract. So it's important to smooth price fluctuations. And in doing so, one suggestion here is to accumulate resource to fund a business adaptation type of fund, to get some of resource from oil and gas and make sure you create incentives for transition to green fuels. And here, this type of fund could also benefit from, if it's ever adopted, a carbon tax. So you promote not only a change of the industrial structure by creating incentives for players to try to find the economically most efficient way to produce while reducing their carbon emissions, but you also fund resource for companies to make that leap. So that's one way of trying to achieve this tough balance of smoothing this energy transition. So that is for the legacy sector, make sure that they are future-proof. But another opportunity for energy transition is try to seize new business opportunities. In here, we do suggest some policies related to create incentives for renewable energy. And one of them is to make sure that you create an electrical vehicles infrastructure and manufacture. Make sure that our automobile industry is future-proof. It goes beyond the internal combustion engine. But here there's a lot of externality effects and network effects. You're not going to buy electric vehicle if you are not going to find chargers, and you're not going to invest solely on chargers if there's no market for electric vehicles and so on. So whenever you have these coordination problems, the government can step in and provide public good. Malaysia has had policies in that regard. Green Tech has worked on that. Here, the suggestion is to more aggressively pursue that route. And also, if you're going to electrify the transportation sector, it's important to not electrify it based on coal generation. So that's something to think about. Another suggestion is to further develop Malaysia's solar photovoltaic capability by deepening the domestic linkages. Here you have solar PV installers, you have the third biggest manufacturing of solar PV panels, but not necessarily R&D. So there are a lot of opportunities to make sure that this industry really creates a hub in Malaysia. Finally, we talk about the importance of adapting the infrastructure. One of the things that this new world of energy is that the grid itself is put under a lot of strain with variable intermittent type of generation, the decentralization of generation. So one of the suggestions here is to further advance on smart grids with real-time pricing to promote energy efficiency and higher penetration of the intermittent renewables. There's a big limit to increase the share of intermittent renewables under not up-to-date grid. So that will require a lot of investment. That can also be seen as an opportunity for job creation and make sure that Malaysia is future-proof. So here are some of our suggestions. We would like to thank you a lot. Leave our contact. I've seen that there are many questions coming along, but now I will turn back to Tricia, and I look forward for the comments of all the participants, and also, of course, Dr. Fazlul, Dr. Sanjayan.
Thank you very much to Renato and Matthias for your presentation. I think you've encapsulated the points that you've made in the paper very well, essentially asking the question of, how does Malaysia foresee its use of its energy mix in the future while having to balance the various challenges. And Renato, if I may ask you to stop sharing your screen, that would be nice. Although we do like your desktop backdrop. Okay, so to the others who have joined us, I would like for you to, if you have any questions and comments, to put them into the Q&A little box there. Don't put that into the chat because I would, just look at the Q&A and then I'm going to compile them later. For now, I'd like to pass the time to Datuk Fazlur Rahman Zainuddin from TNB, and then we'll go on to Dr. Sanjayan, and then we'll have an open discussion. So Datuk Fazlur, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Tricia, for the opportunity to be here. I'm very happy to be part of this discourse on the energy landscape for the country. I think this is a very important question that all of us will need to be very much aware of, and I hope we are collectively all involved in this conversation around the energy choices that our country will have to make going forward. Now, just a very quick thing before I go into my response to Renato's and Matthias' presentation. I represent Tenaga Nasional. I'm the Strategy and Regulatory Officer here. Tenaga Nasional, as many of you know, will actually provides the electricity supply for the country. We are a participant in the market, and we would actually then, support the various government policies during this period of whatever period of time that is necessary, that the government believes is necessary for the country. Yeah. Having said that, we also, as a provider of electricity for the past 71 years, we have quite a bit of experience in the provision of the service. And also we've done quite a bit of thoughts around the ever-evolving energy landscape, which I think I'm happy to share here in terms of some of our thoughts. Firstly, thank you very much, Renato and Matthias, for the presentation and also the article. I mean, to me, my immediate reaction to it is that I think broadly, I think we are probably on the same page with regards to your thoughts on the future energy landscape. Now, for us, we believe that going forward, the various countries will have to make choices and decisions in moving its energy from conventional to more sustainable sources of energy. At Tenaga, we do have that view as well. I mean, to put it in short, some thoughts around that to summarize before I go into a bit more detail. I think as we start to look at the future, I would summarize it. Number one, more renewables. Number two, more investment into the grid to support that renewables, so smart grid investments and storage in particular. Number three, I think gas will still have a role in this landscape. So probably a maintain position on gas. And coal, as we see, there will be a reduction as we see the expiry of the various PPAs. Yeah, so that's basically the view: more renewables, more grid investment, maintain gas, and reduce on coal. So let me just talk about this in a little bit of further depth. Huh? Now, as we look at the country and which is facing, like many other countries, this crisis of this pandemic, and therefore also the economic impact as a result, there's a strong need to really shift our thinking towards the recovery of the economies, right? And usually when you start to think about recovery of economies, you have to start thinking about doing different things compared to what you did before. Yeah, so if you keep on doing the same things, probably actually not get any significant change in terms of the economy going forward. And I think as we start to look at the situation that we're facing here, perhaps there is an opportunity as we start to think about the economic recovery to look at a more sustainable or green or sustainability based economic driver, yeah, going forward. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that unfortunately, what we need to do for different countries, Malaysia in particular, there's no cookie cutter. So there's no simple formula that actually can be applied for everybody. Yeah, Malaysia has probably different starting points compared to many other countries. Certainly, as compared to maybe the more developed nations, we will have a very different starting point. For example, earlier Renato talked about the energy trilemma, balancing between what you call energy sustainability, energy security, and energy equity. It's always been a challenge, I guess, in the past because of affordability and accessibility. Yeah, so that's something which the starting point for Malaysia. Yes, Malaysia has evolved and advanced forward, and I think going forward we'll have to take some of these starting points in consideration. Now, the unique, so third point here is that, where is the starting point for Malaysia? Well, if you look at where Malaysia is right now, and well, I can speak about Peninsular Malaysia because Tenaga Nasional serves the Peninsular Malaysia market. So if you look at Peninsular Malaysia, the penetration of electrification is close to 100%, 99.8%. And in terms of the capacity, in terms of provision of electricity, the system has in a high capacity situation, yeah, with reserve margins between 30 to 50% over the next 10 years. So now normal reserve margin is probably around 28%. So I think we've got quite a lot of capacity over the next 10 years. What that means for us is that for Malaysia, or for Peninsular Malaysia, is that we might not need to further plant up conventional capacity over the next 10 years because we already have enough. Of course, over time, that capacity will start to come down because, you know, old plants starts to expire, yeah, and they go off the grid. So then you probably at some point need to build some further capacity. And we see that by 2030 is when, you know, roughly around that time, that new additional capacity will need to be secured. So that's one starting point. The other starting point here for Malaysia, I think Malaysia has done some good effort in relation to advancing renewables over the years. Thanks to Dr. Sanjayan and the team for pushing a lot of this. And I think over the recent couple of years, we've seen the large-scale solar auction programs, which has been, I would say, quite successful. The first auction, the bid prices for energy was around 40 cents per kilowatt hour. And the third series of the auction was LSS3. The auction prices were in around the 20s, yeah. So between 17 cents and about 23 cents per kilowatt hour. So on average about 20 cents. And now what that means is that it is already at the energy cost of solar PVs are already at par, or actually more competitive compared to gas. Yeah. Now moving forward, we still see that there are further opportunities for the solar PV energy costs to further reduce, and we've looked at it. Looking ahead another 5 years, we will expect to see some further reductions of probably around 5 cents further reduction. So this is something which actually gives us some opportunity. And as I said just now, if the system will need some additional capacity in 30 years, and I think, sorry, not 30 years, 2030, in about 10 years time, and then by that time, we see that solar PVs, have a very strong opportunity to contribute towards that capacity requirements. And we believe that as we continue to build that pipeline of solar PVs over consistently throughout the next 10 years, you can leverage on economies of scale and all those procurement benefits that actually drive those costs down further. Yeah. Now, on top of that, it starts to get interesting with storage technology. In our energy transition study, we saw that storage technology prices are also following a certain similar trend that we saw for solar PVs and other renewable energy kind of technologies. So we are quite optimistic that the prices of storage will also come down, and we anticipate, based on various studies that we've used or referred to, before the end of the decade, around 2030, we would see that storage plus solar PVs, becoming quite competitive compared to, let's say, a gas peaker. Yeah. So when the system needs some capacity in 2030, then we've got choices, right? We've got choices of gas plants, hydro, coal, renewable plus storage. Yeah? Of course, as we look at those choices, we start to see that, well, coal maybe not so attractive. So if you want to build a coal plant, you have to also ensure that that coal plant, if you're building it in 10 years time, will be still viable in another 20 years time, because so that poses some risks, right? So coal at this point in time, we don't think is a good choice going forward. So that leaves gas, hydro, and renewables, and I think gas will have some kind of role, but I think there's great opportunity for renewables to actually start to increase its percentage of the system. Yeah, and with storage, I think that's going to be a good chance. Now, I've been talking a lot about solar PV, but I think in Malaysia we also have other sources like hydros. I think hydro is another opportunity that perhaps can be further explored. Wind, not so much, but of course it will be various other options like biomass, biogas, but these are small comparatively to the solar PVs, etc. Yeah, so this is where I guess the Malaysia starting point. I think as we look at some of the choices for Malaysia going forward, I think increasingly we probably look at affordable decarbonization using affordable. Make sure that solar PVs and storage technologies are becoming increasingly affordable, driving energy efficiency, because particularly on the demand side, managing energy efficiencies, reducing the peak that we always see in the middle of the day in Malaysia because of the heat here. That's another element, but also reducing overall consumption. So energy efficiency solutions, the signaling to the market, coming up with goals and targets with regards to building efficiencies, industrial sector efficiencies, equipment efficiencies becomes an important element in stimulating that effort. And the other one is actually around electrification of mobility. I think that's another element to also address the overall energy emissions and consumptions on the demand side. So as we look at all of this, I think there may be certain things that we need. I think immediately as a country we need to do take some serious actions. The time seems to be around now because everybody's thinking about how do we get out of this crisis? What choices do we make? Where do we allocate resources and capital? Where should we focus our policy areas, emphasis? And we think that it is important that we get strong alignment across all stakeholders, industry players, government, policymakers, civil society, NGOs, academia, etc. Getting alignment so that we have a coherent view of the energy landscape going forward. I think one of the challenges as we start to do this, if it's done in bits and pieces, then we got problems, right? So if, let's say earlier, Renato talked about EVs, right? If you actually want to push on EVs, but then the generation mix doesn't change, it's still predominantly coal, then you got problems, right? So you need to have some coherent kind of policies around this. And I think that's important. And as far as Tenaga Nasional is concerned, we are very we'll be very excited to participate in this process. So yeah, thank you. I mean, for the opportunity, Tricia, over to you.
Thank you, Datuk Fazlor. It's really nice to hear all the positive things that are coming from you representing TNB. We're quite pleased to hear your views, and thank you as well for reading the paper and giving such a thorough feedback. I have a quick question actually, just on something that you said before I forget. So you mentioned that Malaysia currently has a reserve margin of about 28%, and I was just wondering, how does that sit in relation to other countries? Like, what is the reserve margin that's typically adopted by other countries, and is there a need to have like such a high reserve margin? I mean, I absolutely am not the expert here, but would be good to hear your views.
Yeah, I think in terms of reserve margin, I mean, for Malaysia, there is this there's a formula, I guess, in a way, a mechanism to actually determine what's appropriately reserve margin for the country. For Peninsular Malaysia, it's about 28%. That's a required, and this is based on certain kind of assumption on loss of load. So as but this is actually more policy driven. Yeah, it's driven by the regulator, whereby the regulator will actually decide in terms of what is an acceptable loss of load in a year. Yeah. And from there, what kind of capacity is required in order to actually ensure that that loss of load is actually within that parameter. And from that perspective, is actually about 28%. Now, I guess different countries have different kind of situations. If I were to look at, let's say, for example, Europe, the reserve margins are a lot lower. Now, that's different in Europe because there's a lot of interconnections between the different countries, different jurisdictions. So if, let's say, for example, a particular country doesn't have the kind of capacity, can always actually, bring in import energy from others. I think in Southeast Asia, the maturity level of the interconnection is not there yet. I mean, we're starting a little bit here and there, but it's not something to a level that actually can, tap on our neighboring countries for additional capacity should we need that. So based on where we are today, these are the numbers. Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, if I look at the next 10 years, it is between 30 to 50%. So that's actually quite a lot, right? So which means that we have ample capacity. And I think as we take more renewables, I think the system can cope because there's sufficient thermal conventional capacity to be able to deal with the intermittency of renewables over the next 10 years, right up to 2030 when we need additional more capacity.
Okay, thank you, Dato. All right, I don't want to leave our final commentator too late. So Dr. Sanjayan Velautam, who is from SEDA. So I did not mention the full name earlier. It's the Sustainable Energy Development Authority. And Dr. Sanjayan, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Tricia. Firstly, I think I'm very thankful that you've invited SEDA to be part of this. Quite an interesting publications, and especially very timely because it talks about the mix of the future and where we are going towards. And Secondly, I think I need to congratulate the team. Very thoroughly written publication, very factual, indicating what I think talks about evaluating the past, considering where we are today, and hopefully visualizing where we want to be in the coming term of 2030 or 2035. I think very pertinent points were raised by both Matthias and Renato, and I may have some comments on that. But before I get into that, I just want to touch base for people who may not know what SEDA is, and just sort of explain that the Sustainable Energy Development Authority is actually a statutory body under the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources. And it was, as Ronaldo said, in 2011, it was set up under the enactment of the Sustainable Energy Development Authority Act. And together with that was the Renewable Energy Act. And just about the functions of it, there are two main functions. We sort of play the advisory role to the minister and the relevant government agencies on matters pertaining to sustainable energy. We do the implementation and manage and monitor sustainable energy programs. And just to get everyone on the same page, sustainable energy, of course, this platform talks a lot about renewable energy and the fossil fuel mix. Sustainable energy has also to include the energy efficiency and conservations programs that we do in Malaysia. So it's two aspects: renewable energy, energy efficiency and conservation is what we look at as sustainable energy. And coming to the publication that was just presented to us, I think a little bit of evaluating the past. I think very well done in 1979. You talked about how the first energy policy, a national energy policy, was put up. But the interesting part is on the fifth fuel policy in 2001, where Malaysia actually emphasized on the use of sustainable energy, renewable energy and EE. And that led to the 9th Malaysian Plan, where we set RE targets, right? We set some targets, and in your paper, you've put 350 megawatts. I'm not very sure of the numbers, but it is a certain target that was set has RE grid connected. And at the end of 2010, when they measured this and they realized they were nowhere near what the targets were set, it was less than 100 megawatts. So that's when I think the churn of a National Renewable Energy Policy and Action Plan was set up. And with that in 2011 came about the Renewable Energy Act. So that's a little bit of the future, but where are we today in the renewable energy connected to grid? We are hovering around nearly 2,000 megawatts. So that's the rate of the last 10 years in which Malaysia has set its policies and continuously upgraded the policies to move the ground of energy transition from a very low 100 or less than 100 to around 2,000 megawatts today connected as renewable energy. And that trajectory, I think, is what we would like to see to ensure that the businesses are growing at a rate that enables, what I would think is the steady flow of renewable energy projects at a ramp rate that generates sustainable or stable growth for the local EPC environment. And it has to be at that rate to encourage that things. I think Renato's touched on the trade-offs. I think the trilemma of energy is definitely affordability, environment, and of course you talked about carbon reduction, which I think is part of environment as well. And I think you touched, I think Matthias touched on the difficulty of stability of supply, having the grid fortified so that it's able to take bigger portions of variable renewable energy. Renewable energy can be actually divided or subcategorized as dispatchable renewable energy, which is the hydros, the biomasses, and the biogas. And then there is this variable in Malaysia, of course, as Dato has alluded to, there's not much of wind, but a lot is going on the solar side of things. The LSS program, the large solar scale programs. We got the NEM, which was not mentioned, but there is a program called the Net Energy Metering Program where we are addressing rooftops. There are about 4.2 million rooftops in Malaysia. So there is a huge potential of reaching out to these and connecting those smaller sized domestic industrial and commercial players onto a solar program as well. But with all that emphasis on solar, then there is this difficulty of ensuring that the grid is maintained in a stable form. And of course, if you go home and you flick a switch and you don't have electricity, I think Dato' Fazlul will get a call, yeah, complaining about why are we not having supply at the point of I triggering a switch. But that's where the depth of how are we going to balance affordability, the stability of the grid to take that amount of variable renewable energy, which is growing very fast in Malaysia, and of course, the effects of the environment. So I think you touched very well on that. And I think that's, of course, a challenge. And that's definitely something I think TNB is working on, something called the grid of the future. They know that, they seem to understand that these are things that need to come in. And I'm sure in the coming years, that should be addressed as one of the main important points to ensure the stability of our system. And when we are talking, I know you talked about oil and gas, but from my expertise, it's very related to electricity, yeah? So I'll be just touching on the electricity portion of it. And then, of course, there were some suggestions in terms of knowledge transfer and the local capacity in enhancing the need. Renewable energy in Malaysia, if you look at it, and from maybe Europe, it's different. It's still a nascent industry. And when you're talking about nascent industries, you definitely talk about improved knowledge transfer and local capabilities. Talking also about the local content requirement in terms of the knowledge that is coming to the EPCs to be retained in the market and how this is going to be grown. So when we talk about this, that's technology, right? And when you talk about the technologies, I think we are very much in the same page, where the fourth industrial revolution is right here. Those who are going to embrace it is going to have the advantage of moving forward. And so I think when we talk about the energy transition in Malaysia, we are definitely going to embrace the technologies that are going to come. Dato' talked about, you know, the solar storage that is required, fortifying the grid in terms of protection and stability, ensuring the generation technologies are improving in capacity of what I would say the efficiencies, even coal plants, yeah? Of course, we are trying to avoid as much as possible of coal generation, but in reality, the affordability and the intermix is something that we'll have to take into account. And coal plants itself are, you know, we have moved, I think in Malaysia, we are, you know, we have ultra supercritical plants. The efficiencies of it is quite high. Gas turbines are coming in at 60% of efficiencies. So definitely all this must be taken into the equation in terms of bringing that knowledge base into it. So policies, I think three things are very important in terms of looking at this transition. One, as we said, the policies and framework that needs to ensure that we are definitely ramping up in the right direction towards greener energy. Number two is, of course, technology in all its different guises are going to be part of this solution, and how we integrate that is very important. And number three is, of course, the financing. The banks, the local banks, how do they mitigate the risk or understand the risk of these nascent industries that are coming on board? And it's our duty to also bring that awareness to this. And I think, you know, the 12th Malaysian Plan will be coming up, And one of the themes around it is actually low carbon economy and how we are going to develop. So Malaysia is very much in the track of ensuring that we are supporting, as our global commitment is in the COP21 or the Paris Accord, to ensure that we are definitely aligned to bringing that. But at the same time, the trilemma and the challenges we have, and at what stage, and I think Dato alluded to, where is our starting point? Where are we in compared to other countries? And I think that's very important to take. And how we stage that over the next few years is very important. So how careful power systems planning, number one. Forecasting methods, because of variable renewable energy needs better forecasting methods, right? Imposing requirements of variable RE integration into the grid. Standardizations of structural processes, conducting studies in compliance of the grid code. So there are many things that need to be put in place, and to ensure that when we get in there, we are actually letting people enjoy green energy at a very stable and, without interruptions. So that's part of it. And I think that was very well presented in your publications. The other one was, of course, the adaptation and the upgrading of your oil and gas infrastructures and how that needs to be. Electricity for the time being in Malaysia is very vertically integrated. So business models and how do we need to do innovative ideas of business models are something that we should be looking at to encourage, people, prosumers and consumers to take up. And NEM is a very good example how a simple individual can actually play into the space of producing renewable energy at his home. So these are projects that have been put in place in Malaysia. And there are many things that we'll still need to work on. And I think work like this with suggestions that we have seen are going to tremendously help us, especially policymakers and of course the industry, to look at these suggestions and see how then we can operationalize these suggestions so that they can yield the results that we want in the next few years. These are some of the points that I've seen from your publications, but congratulations again.
All right, thank you very much to Dr. Sanjayan. I was hoping for a bit more disagreement so we could have a little bit.
we could if you want.
Line, so maybe I can be the person who becomes a devil's advocate. But okay, on the outset, can I just do a little bit of a timekeeping? So we're at 4:05 now. With your permission, maybe I can go about 5 minutes overboard. So we do have half an hour to address all the questions. There are a lot of questions. There are 33 there. So I'm going to try my best to go through all of them, but I can also request the four of you in interest of time, if you are able to answer any of them by typing the answers them out to the questions, then that would save us a bit of time. But at the same time, but also try to focus on what I'm saying and what each other is saying. So, okay, the questions seem to be categorized into like 4 different sections. So I'm going to try and segment them. So first, there are still a bunch of questions that are addressing the issues of coal. And then the second bunch of questions is about, by when can we be fully RE? Is there a time where we would be 100% renewable energy? And then the third set of questions goes into the specific types of renewables, right? So there's a lot of questions about the different types like biomass, biogas, solar, hydro, hydrogen fuel cells as well. And then finally, the fourth set of questions sort of talks about government policy and what TNB policy specifically would be with regards to things like gas market liberalization. And of course, the trickiest thing I think is to kind of balance our desire to move into clean energy with the cost issue, the pricing issue. Okay, so let's try and get through the coal questions first. So let me try and select the coal questions. Okay, what efforts are being made to retire coal plants early, and which plants will be retired? Let me get through. Okay, will TNB agree that there are any new PPAs for coal? And by what date will there be no coal used? And there was one more question about the impact on the economy. Let me try and look for it. Okay, why don't we address that first, and then, oh right, okay, sorry, there's more coal. So TNB runs, sorry, a lot of TNB questions. TNB runs all 17 coal units today when it's available, and gas uptake fluctuates based on coal plant availability. Apart from causing operational challenges to pipeline gas producers, it impacts profitability of developed gas assets. Does not appear there's any drive for TNB to dispatch other than using fuel price. Comments. And there was one more about GLCs. I think the question was what share of government GLCs is in other. Is there any Malaysian companies or GLC that have an equity participation in the coal companies that we are importing from? So this question is sort of saying that by focusing on domestic gas and renewables, it'll be more beneficial to our country in terms of spurring our own economy internally. So that would be all of the coal-related questions. I suppose Datuk Fazlur, sorry to push it to you, but I think any of the speakers can also feel free to jump in.
No, thank you, Trisha. That's fine. But wow, there's so many cool questions. So where do I start? But perhaps I can maybe just provide a bit first some context on the generation mix that we have in the country today. Now, if I go back to the main kind of energy policy balance that we need to also always achieve is actually this the energy security, energy sustainability, and also energy equity, which is about affordability and access. And I think if I were to look at the comparison between different sources of energy, and in Malaysia, in Peninsular Malaysia, predominantly the sources of energy is coming from coal and gas. I mean, that's Peninsular Malaysia. Sarawak has a lot more hydro, but Peninsular Malaysia is actually more dominated by coal and gas. So if I were to just look at simplifying that between coal and gas in terms of pricing, certainly in terms of where things are today, coal is actually a lot cheaper than gas. So if I were to take, let's say, the Q2 numbers in terms of coal cost of electricity, it's roughly in the mid-teens kind of cent per kilowatt hour, whereas gas is actually low 20s. So basically, the coal has roughly a 25% kind of cost advantage compared to gas. So that's generally what. And I think how the system works is that it is a regulated market. So the government will look at the choices of the energy to meet whatever the needs of the country, and the needs of the country at this point in time in terms of emphasis, it's all about making sure that's affordability, because I think as a country in our stage of development, affordability is actually a big important consideration. I think it's something that which many Malaysians probably can relate to. We are very price conscious about things, right? So I think that's the main thing. So as we start to look at those parameters, then again in planning out the planting up over the next how many years will be done on those bases. So again, this is something which the ministry together with the regulator will actually do that. Now, from our perspective, so in terms of coal, Renato talked about the evolution, replacing coal with gas, and as we need to do more to accelerate the process of transition of energy to cleaner sources of energy. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the system has a certain level of reserve margin capacity, and that's declining. Now, to give you an idea, by 2032, today the generation capacity are based on power purchase agreements or contracts, which actually last 21 or 25 years. Now, the question is, does the country want to terminate some of these contracts? We think no. We think no, because that would be quite an expensive exercise. These contracts have financial implications. However, having said that, contracts, these PPAs are in the process of expiring, yeah, many of them. So if I were to look ahead to 2032, about 5.6 gigawatts of coal will be coming out, yeah. So the total, so roughly the coal capacity is about 10 gigawatts of capacity. So half of it will come off the system by 2032. So basically that's something that's happening. And of course, beyond that, the expiry is going on. Yeah. So for us, what we think is that there is that any natural kind of reduction of coal capacity anyway over the next few years. But what's also an opportunity is that within this next 10 years, as renewable prices, renewable energy costs come down, there's opportunity to actually increase that percentage, yeah, of the generation capacity. So I suppose that's the large bulk of, I guess, the questions around coal. Why we still have coal? Basically because of affordability. The price is at advantage. So when we dispatch the different plants to generate electricity, it's always done in a merit order, meaning that the lowest or the cheapest energy source gets dispatched first, yeah, and then it moves on to the next one after that, right?
Okay.
Risha, can I just add something? Yeah, just a thought. You know, there was questions on retirement of coal and all that. I think in a timely order, this will happen. I think in the next few years, Malaysia, you know, we heard TNB say in the papers, they're not planting up any more coal plants in the next few years, at least. But one of the things I want to relate to is, again, Ronaldo talked about the retraining, you know, even in the oil and gas, bringing people up to speed in skills to go on to a new technology. So we must also remember that the coal generation is an industry. Local players are there, job creation is there, and we need to transition these people to actually acquire skills in other technologies. And that has to be also planned out during that phase of time. So I think that's an equation that, you know, a variable in that equation we have to understand as well.
Oh, that's a really absolutely good point. I mean, we have to think about the talent in the country, and as you're right, we have to retrain them into moving into new sectors. Okay, so I'm going to the second set of questions. I'll talk everything about renewable energy, and then I'll leave the third section on other things like tariffs and you know, policy and so on. So okay, we'll try and get through this. So let's see. So how soon can Malaysia be 100% renewable energy? Do you think we'll ever stop relying on fossil fuel, including natural gas? So basically moving into fully RE. And then we have very specific things, right? So, okay, any view on the potential of pump storage hydro in Malaysia? And then we have solar. So Ford tried to develop solar energy panel driven automobiles. How successful or difficult was that? Let's see. Okay, with the increasing integration of RE, excluding large-scale hydro into power generation in Malaysia, how much RE is eventually being dispatched and consumed? And what's your opinion on the resiliency of RE when compared to conventional energy sources? Are there more RE being dispatched and consumed during a crisis like the pandemic? On REs, okay, yeah. Okay, we have, now we talk about hydro. We have significant hydro projects already and the mountainous nature of some areas. So what are the barriers to expanding hydro use? Is it technical, financial, ecology, accessibility, for example? Okay, I think, sorry, the question about burning gas when coal is cheaper, that's been already addressed by Datuk Fazlo earlier. Hydrogen fuel cells. Hydrogen products are predominantly blue hydrogen, with only about 1% being green hydrogen. And this was something that a speaker said at a global utilities webinar. Not clear what that question is actually to the person who's asking. And green, again, another question on green hydrogen fuel cell facilities in support of greening logistics sectors. considering that Maersk and Airbus and Chinese government are moving towards zero, rising their carbon emissions in logistics. Sorry, I know there's a lot for all of you to address. I will stop soon. I'm just trying to pick out anything else specific to like renewable energies, and I'll leave aside the policy for the last segment. I think there are some questions on nuclear as well. Nuclear energy. I think maybe somebody's addressed that, but I think in big picture, sort of like, okay, by what stage can we get to fully RE? And what's the resiliency of that? How much is being dispatched now? And then like if each of you wants to talk about specific areas of types of renewables, then you can talk about biomass, biogas, solar, hydro pump storage, nuclear, hydrogen fuel cells. So let's try to address that set of questions. All right, who would like to go first? Renato.
Okay, happy to take some of these questions. It's extremely challenging to think that a country of a sizable population can fully move towards being 100% on renewable energy or 0% as zero carbon emission. Some countries might be able to do due to particular hydrology characteristics, but that's not likely to be the case of Malaysia. But you can do a lot if you reach 80%, and if you achieve all of the efficiencies that you can get to that, that is fantastic from an environmental point of view. But one key thing, and I think a lot of the questions touched on that, about asking about what is the role of particular technologies of hydrogen or nuclear and so on, is that unlike the economy or society or civilization of the past, where you did have one primary driver of primary energy, either wood or manure, switching later to coal that fostered the industrial revolution, then to the oil age of the 20th century. This moment of energy transition, we will not have one single source of energy or energy carrier. We will have to deal with a menu that will vary according to the potential for each country, and also its level of economic development or different political coalitions. So in reality, we will have an all of the above. Some countries will not allow for installation of nuclear energy. Some scientists, they do believe that we need a sustained source of base load generation to be nuclear energy, and there are new designs coming online that might be interesting. But some other environmentalists will point that no, nuclear energy is the least thing that we want to deal with intermittent source of generation to integrate with renewables. So we had one question here, Cheng Hao Bo asking about biofuels in Brazil. That's true. Brazil developed a fantastic biofuels program related to ethanol, but it's also very related to one technology, ICE, internal combustion engine. So it's a great substitute for one type of fuel, gasoline, but it's not necessarily for a world of EVs. So it's really challenging when you put all of these things together, which just shows that in a debate about energy policy, you have to have a lot of people on the table to voice a lot of opinions and try to coordinate it in a policy that makes sense for the particular circumstance of the country.
All right, thank you, Renato. Anyone else on that set of questions? Renewable energies, different types, yes.
Yeah, can I just add on to what Renato said? And I agree with that. In terms of having the choices, and I think Dato also alluded to this point of giving that choices, and technology in all its form is going to bring that choices to us, and whichever is going to give us the optimized method of generating the useful form of energy that we want is what we will make the choice. So to just address some of the questions, when will we ever be 100% RE? You know, that's a very difficult question, but where are we today? In Malaysia, if you take all the hydro systems and all that, we had about 22% renewable energy. This is installed capacity, and the rest is, of course, coal and gas. But what happens is when we are comparing electricity, one is installed capacity and one is the power that is generating the electricity. And that's where we talk about the reserves and how much can come into what we call the base load that is necessary. And this is where some countries think nuclear could be the resultant of that base load that we talk about. And then the other one is this dispatchable, smaller systems. And to me, if you ask me, I think we will move towards, like Europe has said in 2050, they are becoming carbon neutral. That means the sinks and the emissions are balanced off. It is not zero per se, I would think. And in that directions, I think the first step in Malaysia is we'll move towards a low carbon sort of a structure in energy. And what you will see is between the next 10 years, you will see more and more renewable energies coming in to hopefully counter the 46% that Ronaldo said about coal to 46% of renewable energy. That's the assumption that we are going on. So there are many types of renewable energy, and that's right. In terms of the intensity of fossil fuel, one coal plant can be 800 or 1,000 megawatts, right? Hydro is the only one that competes in the intensity of building that sizes. But when you talk about biomass, biogas, or smaller hydros, we in Malaysia are talking about 30 megawatts, 50. So there's multiples of that at different locations that need to be put together to be connected to an electrical grid. So that itself is a challenge in terms of the logistics of bringing these interior powers into the central grid. So that's the things that we will need to overcome. And I think with technology, with discussions, this will be overcome. We don't have pump storage in Malaysia, but some of the hydros can work in terms of spinning reserves to bring in the needed impetus to stabilize the system. They talked about hydrogen. Hydrogen is relatively new. Sarawak, the state of Sarawak in Malaysia, which has actually more than 70% of renewable energy because they actually work on hydro, a lot of their electricity, and they are trying to produce green hydrogen. And with that, there are a lot of prototypes and test bidding that's going on. And if that takes off, then green hydrogen would be something that would be able to be used in other parts of Malaysia. That's my input for the time.
Thank you. I think we also jumped kind of straight from coal discussion into renewable energy discussion, forgetting the middle part on gas. So I think I'm going to return to that part. And there's some questions here related to gas and ONG. So is Malaysia's domestic gas supply sufficient for energy needs during the transition period? I think this is what Renato sort of implied, right, through that graph. And then with the TPA progressing, that's third-party access in Malaysia, what is TNB's view on the current pace of gas market liberalization and attracting more players to import gas for power versus continuing to rely on coal plants? I think you answered a little bit of that, Dr. Fazlur, but we can go more into it if you want. And then just trying to pick out anything else on ONG. Okay, Prof. Renato, speaking of ONG in Malaysia, what is your opinion of the role of carbon capture and storage in decarbonizing Malaysia's energy sector while reviving the economy post-pandemic by leveraging expertise from the industry? Energy suppliers, oil and gas power, they require appropriate signals for the market. Okay, so this is actually, we're already talking about the policy, right? I'm not sure who can speak on policy, but it requires market-friendly policies and regulations. Policymakers and regulators have the tendency to intervene primarily when it comes to only aspects of the trilemma that Dr. Sanjaya mentioned, affordability and so on. This creates distortions. How can we minimize these interventions and let the market resolve itself? I think it's related to the liberalization question earlier. And finally, coal-fired power plant projects in the past rely on local funding, but with the latest ESG requirements on institutional investors, would financing new projects be a challenge? And yes, we do hear that ESG is increasingly becoming a requirement for almost everything, right? Financing, banking, and so on. I'm trying to answer, but there's so many more questions. I'm really sorry if we can't answer everything, but on the oil and gas and as well as the liberalization questions, anything you'd like to add? And Matthias, I'm sorry, we've also left you out. So if you have anything to add, please do jump in. Anything on those sets?
I think, Renato, if you want to go first on the oil and gas things, that's more you. Then I have a few comments for the renewable infrastructure discussion as well after.
Okay, so oil and gas, Renato?
Okay. So let me address first the issue of carbon capture storage. It's a promising technology, but not feasible, economically feasible yet. Some companies like Exxon, for example, they made a bet on that. There's no problem with, what's the problem of oil and gas? Is it carbon emissions? If we can get to capture it at a cost-effective way, we don't have to work our way out of oil and gas. We can deal with that issue. It has not been proven to be economically feasible yet. There might be some opportunities for that. I think IEA just published a report this week about it. It's one route, but unlikely to be a silver bullet. It's something that will probably be one part of a menu of solutions. Another question, is there enough gas to meet Malaysia's need? In reality, I think the short answer would be, well, it depends on how long do you think the transition will be. But in reality, you need to keep every year, you need to keep investing into exploration to be able to produce. The Malaysia's reserves are not going to be much more than 10 years if you stop the exploring. And one of the incentives to keep exploring is be able to have a reasonable break-even price. While, for example, there's a lot of debate about increasing royalties, what it means is that it just decreases the attractiveness of investing into E&P in Malaysia. Basically, oil and gas companies, they manage a global portfolio. They go where they can find good opportunities. And if Malaysia is becoming less of an attractive place to do exploration production, then you're going to see a lower and lower amount of gas and crude oil coming from the country. Basically, oil and gas production in Malaysia peaked in 2003 and stayed more or less the same until 2017 and has been going down, but it's mostly stable. It is a challenge to be able to increase its production at the same time that you meet the export commitments. So the best way of seeing what's a good way forward is not to replace exports just to use domestically, but rather to create the necessary incentives to increase the domestic intake and then replace coal as Dr. Fazlou, 2030, it's not so far away when we talk about the time frame of E&P exploration. It requires a lot of time to prospect an area, to identify a resource, to drill it, and then create the whole commercial structure around it.
Matthias, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear Renato also talk about the lead time necessary to make sure you have sufficient supply of oil and gas, because in some ways that applies to renewables as well, because you have to look at it as a system with support systems that are required for each of the technologies you're looking at to integrating into the entire ecosystem. Some of the examples that were brought up, things like nuclear. Nuclear can be a great solution for some energy systems, but it's not dispatchable because it takes like 3 weeks to switch on or off a nuclear power plant. There's a huge infrastructure that's required to run it properly, because you need fuel imports, you need refining fuels, you have huge waste issues that are not solved in many parts of the world that have active nuclear and have had for many years. So you need all of those support systems. The same goes for pumped storage. That would mean you have to, if you want to use pumped storage as your dispatchable source, it means you have to migrate your current dammed hydro into your dispatchable service, which means they can't run base load. So you need to displace the base load role that dammed hydro plays now. And so if you look at it through that lens, 10 years is really not a long time. Like, we really need to start right now figuring out what should our future energy system look like. What are the levers we can pull to do it differently? Biomass was one of the other examples that's brought up. Biomass is largely unutilized for centralized energy production. A few people are doing smaller things, but there's a few hundred megawatts worth of fuel that stays in the rural areas because it's very wet, it's very heavy, and it's very dispersed. So you need the infrastructure to collect and refine this fuel, get it centralized for it to play a role in a centralized system. So rather than looking at these individual technologies, it's really important to look at what are the support systems that are necessary and factor that into the calculations when you look at the sort of what I would call the medium term, like 10 years or more.
All right, thank you, Matthias. Okay, so just to let you know, everyone, it's 4:33. We have still many questions to answer, but I think what I'll do is I will just read out the themes of a couple of them, and I'll give each of you a minute or two to, if you want to address, you can. If not, then maybe just give your final remarks, sort of reflections after the last 1.5 hours, and any parting words that you'd like to say to the audience. So some other themes are basically, how does Malaysia develop its policies vis-a-vis the region? So like the other countries, have these solutions worked in other countries? How do we think about a decarbonized economy for the Southeast Asia region? Can ASEAN coalition contribute to the greater adoption of renewables? So kind of regional as well as policy-oriented questions. And then there's some questions on the CO2 tax and the commitment to reducing emissions. And finally, some questions around like bigger picture, whether Malaysian government can sustain and allocate its resources according to the different economic situation in the global issue. So I think, COVID is an interesting thing to start thinking about, and whether that also presents us, a solution. Energy consumption fell during this period, and does that say something about how we would like to plan for the future needs? So let's go in one round, maybe the opposite direction. So Dr. Sanjayan?
All right, thank you. Just a final word. I think someone's touched on ASEAN. Just to share that ASEAN does have what is known as the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Corporations, and within which there are 7 programs that addresses issues how we want to decarbonize ASEAN as well and interconnect ASEAN. So there is this part, but generally I think it is a collective effort by everyone, everyone, not just agencies, governments, researchers, every single person, to start thinking about how best do we reduce our dependency on petroleum products, if the need be and if we can. Mainstreaming environmental conditions when we were planning, so that accelerating renewables, making this energy transition, and you touched about the COVID, an integral part of the recovery that we are talking about, so that we could achieve multiple economic and social objectives in pursuit of a resilient future that takes into account the 3 things: reliability, affordability, and the security of the systems we have in this country. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Trisha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanjayan from SEDA, and Datuk Fazlur now from TNB.
Again, thank you for the opportunity again. Really enjoyed this course. I think for us, I think as we look at the economy post-COVID, we need to start thinking of what the country can do, what we can do to future-proof the whole economy. I think that's the main thing. We need to do a reboot of the economy. I think Malaysia has been an economy which is based on low value add, low skill, low technology. And I think we've long got stuck in this middle income track, and I think it's about time that we need to start to think about policies that shift a few gears forwards, right, towards a more high technology, high skill, and high value add kind of economy. And I think the energy transition presents the perfect opportunity to do so, is to reshape our energy landscape from conventional sources of energy, hydrocarbon based, to something which is a lot more renewable. I think that's an important thing. We need to reduce our dependency on hydrocarbons and move towards something which is better for the next coming years. Now, for us, as you start to think about some policy choices, I think when we talk about the generation mix, having a consistent kind of renewable kind of energy kind of deployment over time, because for us, I think one of the ways to bring down costs is actually the economies of scale. So large numbers of RE deployment in a consistent manner actually can help actually achieve that. Together with that, there will need to be some strengthening of the grid resilience to actually support this increasing renewables. Now, starting now, things won't happen overnight, so you need so consistent application of that throughout the next number of years is actually an important element. Energy storage is an important area, looking at how we can actually bring down that cost significantly enough. So some, I guess, in this way, incentivizing or actually giving more focus on storage. Renato mentioned earlier about Malaysia being the third largest producer of solar PVs outside of China. And I think this is an opportunity for Malaysia, if we push a lot on renewables, for Malaysia to be able to capture some of that value in a local ecosystem. So this is something to also think about. Green financing, definitely an area that is important for this. Electric vehicles now, again, electric vehicles has almost a symbiotic kind of relationship with the rest of the power generation and the system, right? Building the right kind of infrastructure, matching the generation sources with the users of energy, and also a happy, I guess, to our mind, a happy byproduct is actually an increased use of storage, right? Because electric vehicles comes with a heavy need of storage, and this storage, we believe that together with a grid level storage could actually, we've done together and at scale, at economy of scale, could actually bring down costs a lot faster. So we believe that's an area that we should also focus on. And the other one is actually around, again, at the end of the day, demand, managing the demand side of energy consumption, energy efficiency, having the right signals and pricing, encouraging retrofits and installation of more energy efficient kind of equipments, etc. We believe this will create some economic catalyst across the ecosystem, which we believe also is useful to actually reboot Malaysia's economy, move it up the value chain, move it into the future-proof kind of model, and also encourage new technologies and new skill sets. I think that's the important thing that we need to think about. Thank you very much, Trisha and everybody.
Thank you so much, Dato', for your contributions. Matthias, if you have anything further?
Yeah, just very briefly, that I think it's really important, in addition to talking about all these specific energy interventions, specific infrastructure needs, specific things that are needed, I think it's important to look at the ecosystem around it. How do we finance things? How do we bring companies that haven't been active in the energy space, make them, so I know Malaysia has the energy management system, for and so on, but mobilizing resources from the business community, from civil society, and ensuring that we build a general economy that's supportive of these kinds of initiatives, whether that's through a carbon tax, whether it's through other kinds of incentives. I think that's a really big part of the solution, in addition to all the technical needs. That's mostly what we've been talking about today. That's part of what we're, just a quick plug, that's what we're trying to do at If Energy, which is my day job, trying to mobilize the private sector to finance some of these things. So yeah, thank you so much to Ideas for having me on board on this project throughout, and today especially. It's been good. So thank you so much.
Renato.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think this has been an extremely enlightful discussion. I would like to thank all participants and discussants. It's too bad that we are not able to address all the questions. So let me just touch one aspect that highlights the importance of taking this discussion today and how it will play out in 10, 12 years time. Professor Lachlan, Dr. Lachlan mentioned here the issue of potential excessive IPP license approvals as one reason of high margins that we had in the system. I don't know if that is the case, but in 2030, when we have some coal power plants with their contracts about to expire, they do not have to amortize, they do not have to pay back their capital investment, only their new operational costs. And that could make them extremely competitive if you're only buying for the cheapest cost. So the discussion about which policies we signal for the future might really facilitate investors to think about, okay, by 10 years from now, if I bet in this technology, it will be backed by the country as a whole. So discussing these things today are extremely important, and I'm extremely happy to see the level of agreement on some of these issues and how the discussion about energy involves the whole society and how we can work together to create new opportunities, greener Malaysia, but also a richer Malaysia, seizing these opportunities for energy transition. Thank you so much, Ideas, for providing this forum.
Thank you so much, Renato and Matthias, Dr. Sanjay and Dr. Fazlor. I think this has really been a great discussion. Just to inform everyone that I think, like I said at the beginning, energy is something that we have done a little bit of work on. Thank you to, with thanks to our senior fellow Renato. And this discussion today, as well as many discussions that I've been having recently with other stakeholders, really signifies the importance of sustainable, inclusive growth. So the sustainability and the energy question is becoming increasingly mainstream. So I think that's one of the key takeaways, that, you know, we recognize it's not just relegated any longer to people who are specifically invested and interested in energy issues, but it really has become, I think, as Renato says, a whole of society thing. I really like what the closing note that we seem to be talking about. We talked earlier about the importance of retraining talent, providing an ecosystem that can finance efforts to move away from hydrocarbons, and of course understanding the challenges that are still there. So the trilemma that was it Dr. Fazlor or Dr. Sanjayan, I think, said, the affordability, environment, and stability and reliability of energy. How do we move forward as a country, knowing that the population is going to grow, and we do want to grow on the value chain. So thank you again to all of the participants, and I look forward to engaging with some of you more. And please do get in touch with Ideas as we do more of this work in sustainability. And with that, I'd like to officially close today's webinar. And once again, thank you.